So maybe you're one of those people that has never tried port and you've thought, well, I've made it through this far without trying it. Why do I need it now? Today we are going to learn about why you should be drinking port. We are right across the river from the city of Porto, Portugal, in Via Nova de Gaia, where the port wine lodges are located. I think if you're a wine drinker and you've never tried port, there's just a lot you can discover. One of the most interesting things about port wine is the complexity. So it's one of the few wines that can age for decades, if not a century or more. So when you're drinking port, you're able to taste a very unique kind of wine. So not only is the wine itself very rich and complex, but depending on how it's aged, it has a huge difference in the experience of drinking that wine. Okay, so port is a sweet wine, but it is natural sugars that are in the grape. So there's no sugar added, there's no syrups added, there's no additives of any kind whatsoever in port wine. So the reason it's more sweet than wine you're used to is that the fermentation process is stopped by adding brandy to the wine. So that makes it a fortified wine. So there is a distilled spirit added to the wine before it is done fermenting, before all of those sugars have been converted into alcohol by the yeast. So that's where that sweetness comes from, but it adds to the richness of the wine, and it's one of the components that allow port to age for as long as it does, maintaining just the incredible characteristics of the wine. Sugar will always be in balance. It's in balance with the alcohol, it's in balance with the richness of these big grapes that grow in the Douro Valley. So if you're telling me that you're more of a Scotch person or a bourbon drinker, then I'm going to tell you you should absolutely be trying port wine, especially the aged whites and the aged tawnies. Those wines are all about barrel aging. They are aged in small oak barrels, and you get that richness of the charred barrels and what it does to the wine over 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. The most I've had a 90-year white before. Just a really incredible wine drinking experience. I'm a Scotch and bourbon drinker myself, and one of the reasons I like it is what the aging does to the whiskey and the blending. And these things are exactly the same in the world of port. Yes, it's a different experience because it is a sweet fortified wine, but the reason that you fall in love with Scotch or bourbon, it's going to be the same thing when you start trying these aged whites and these aged tawnies. It's the complexity of the wine married to the magic that happens in an oak barrel. As you begin to explore port wine and you've decided to try some, I would recommend you checking out our video on the types of port, because the main families of port are very different one from the next. And just so when you go in, it'll be clear in your head what to expect. So are you tasting a wine that has been aged in oak barrels? Are you tasting a wine that has been aged in bottles? Are you tasting something that has a little bit of age or something with a lot of age? So those kind of things. I always recommend keeping notes of anything you taste. I need to tell myself more than anything, I'm terrible with keeping track. I take notes, but they're all over the place. Because there are so many differences in types of port and the experience between a young vintage and an aged vintage and a tawny port and a 30 or 40 year aged tawny port, if you've tried one thing and you didn't like it, then I really recommend trying something else. There is so much complexity and depth in the world of port. It would be like if someone has never tried Scotch and they taste maybe an Islay Scotch that is very peated, and that's not their thing. Well, then, you know, I would recommend that they try a Highland Scotch for a completely different experience. Now, they're both whiskeys, but the experience between a heavily peated Scotch and a Highland single malt, very different drinking experiences. And you're going to get that same thing with port. There is a lot of personal involvement by the winemaker in every offering of every port house, whether it's what goes into a vintage bottle so that it will age for 10, 20, 50 years, or which tawny ports are pulled from which barrels to create the perfect tawny 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, whichever it is that they feel expresses their spirit of winemaking. Almost all port wine grapes are still picked by hand, and this is due to the requirements of the terrain in the Douro Valley. Incredibly steep mountains, very narrow terraces to plant these vines on, and the only way to do it is picking by hand. A lot of port is still foot trampled. During harvest, these big stone lugares are filled with grapes, and the workers get in there and they put their arms around each other and they move in specific patterns, ways to compress the grapes without releasing too many tannins into the wine. Hopefully, if you've never tried port wine before, this video has got you excited that you now want to go out and try some. You will help us out by liking this video, hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll know when we post new content, and join us back here next week for a new video.